Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Congratulations to Perdana Fellows AA for organizing, for pulling this off. I know how difficult it is, and I think you've done a terrific job. So well done. So, okay, let's get started. We've got a great panel here. The capital markets regulator, the stock exchange, and of course the largest financial services group in the country. So I'm sure you're all very curious to hear their views on climate finance. And I'm going to skew this a little. Let me just give some context as to where the questions are going to be coming from. We recognize that the global risk profile has been increasing significantly. And it's very clear that the cost of inaction, the cost of transition is increasing on a very rapid scale. The size and challenge that we are facing is increasing all the time. We've had almost a year of consecutive temperature rise. And this is leading to multiple tipping points. And of course, we know we're in the middle of the sixth mass extinction as well. And when we consider the loss of economic prosperity, lives, health, inaction is not conceivable. So it is a no-regret decision to invest in adaptation. Now, IPCC recommends the net zero target by 2050 to limit warming to 2 degrees by the end of the century. But we know that we are already at 1.5 degrees now. So of course, we could wait to hit 1.5 degrees of warming on a long-term basis, or we could act now to prevent the cascade of multiple tipping points that the overwhelming majority of scientists have been warning us about. And for this, we need to see an industrial revolution of a scale that we've never seen before. We've been addicted to fossil fuels for at least 150 years, and now we need to decarbonize in well under 3 decades. How are we going to do this? The fiscal capacity of countries are stretched around the world. We're globally close to 100% debt to GDP, and the inflation has remained higher for longer. So the cost of action has also increased. A low interest rate environment obviously would have been far more conducive. But we do know also that a lot of the changes in extreme weather events are already locked in. Even if we were to hit net zero tomorrow, there's more certainty in the adverse weather impacts that we're going to see than there is about inflation, exchange rates, and even artificial intelligence. So the size and challenge we are facing is getting more significant all of the time. And yet, and this is my first question to the panel, how are we able to make informed decisions about the most efficient allocation of capital? We don't have the data sets to make informed decisions, nor do we have clear policy outlines or the assurance of capabilities. For example, are institutions fit for purpose? And you need the financial quantification of climate hazards to make these informed decisions. And this requires access to data sets. Leveraging this combined knowledge base can support resilience and adaptation finance, but it needs to be built in sufficiently early in the design and planning stages. And this will also lead to sharpened accountability as the dual edge of the reporting and disclosure sword. And remember also, when we're looking for data sets, that nature is existential to business and the communities and peoples in which they operate. Nature is now being mainstream because there's a recognition that it fundamentally catalyzes all layers of the climate finance stack. So maybe we will start with Puan Salmah as the capital markets regulator. How can we make informed decisions about the allocation of capital?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Let me first of all join Datin Seri Sunita in congratulating the organizers and certainly the sponsors. I think it's really heartwarming to see young people really get involved. So I would perhaps also just say at the start that perhaps the discussion that I will go into may be a bit general, given the young professionals, to continue to inspire them. But I think if we listen to the points raised in the opening this morning, we will clearly see that the key building blocks have been put in place. I think for a long while, industry, private sector was waiting for some clear direction from government as to where are we heading, and that certainly got when NETA was first launched, it got everyone excited that it clearly set out where are we. If you look at NETA and at the SC, we look at that document quite religiously because it sets very clear direction. Energy sector contributes 78% GHG emission, contributes 27% to GDP and 28% of employment. So it's a big chunk. So taking clear direction, I would say that the document lists out many other solutions. So what we want to do is get into the solutioning state. The other thing that the keynote also addressed is how do we address the funding issues. So that's where the capital market regulators and the financial sector regulators work very closely with industry to see how do we address the funding gap. You're quite right. I think if we're going to get momentum, we will need to get people get involved, the private sector to get involved. So one of the things that the SC has put in place is the funding instruments. And it was addressed this morning about the SRI Sukuk. Maybe let me just pivot very quickly to talk about why in Malaysia we call it sustainable responsible investment. I think internationally you will see ESG. For those who are wondering, it's because that we have the leadership in the Islamic capital market space. And what more can be just than the principle of being fair and equitable than the Islamic capital markets. I think at least that's the ambitions of the Islamic capital market. So clearly what we needed was an instrument to talk about how do we get funding into this space. I'll perhaps go into a little bit more detail later, but I think suffice to say one of the building blocks we wanted to put in place after seeing the policy lever, I think government came up very clearly with NETA on which direction the country is going, how much renewable energy will be scaled up, the focus on solar. We will start looking at hydrogen coming on stream and other alternatives. Of course, Malaysia right now is very focused on solar, but we know that there's technology and ability because we're a rich biodiversity country. There are many other options for us to complement. So one is the funding instruments, what type of funding we can get to close the funding gap. I think NETA talked about a $250 billion gap for us to reach our 2050 ambition. The other big area we can go into a little bit more is disclosure statements. You mentioned that. I think to ensure that there is consistency in understanding the various reports that are put out, we must make sure that it's easily comparable. So the two work that we're looking at is the taxonomy that we have put out, and the other one is ensuring corporate disclosures are also comparable through the use of similar standards. Maybe I'll just pause there.
Very nice segue to the next panelist. But you're right. I think significant ambition has been disclosed. I still remember when Climate Governance Malaysia first started 5 years ago, we couldn't even say net zero. And it was thanks to thought leaders like Datin Seri Sunita here, who made an announcement that at some stage Malaysia has to consider being net zero. 2050 earliest, which as we know a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister said it needs to be 2050. But that was a neat segue to the stock exchange, who is working on enabling us to make informed decisions by leveraging of data. CC, why don't you jump in here?
Thanks, Datin Seri. So firstly, as an exchange, as a company ourselves, we are extremely risk averse. So in terms of our own capital deployment, we don't take a lot of risk in our balance sheet. So we remain a pure operator and we create value for our stakeholders and we take a cut of the value out of the value that we create. For new projects, we look at ROI and more now going through the ESG lens, the project we undertake, are they green, are they sustainable? And very importantly also, are they scalable? So secondly, then as a market operator, what we do is that essentially our role here is to match the business owner needs for fundraising to the investors' criteria and mandate, and more that comes into the ESG lens, that feeds into the need for accurate, trusted, regulated data. Now, from a reporting mandate standpoint, currently not many countries in the world have mandated sustainable reporting. But in Malaysia, we started end of last year, which is for this year, all the main market listed companies will now to start disclose. and more it gets into climate reporting space, whereby 2025 currently it is TCFD, and there are a lot of discussion around how do we facilitate the standards for climate reporting, which IFRS S2, for example, as a possible outcome for the national framework, sustainability framework. Now, as an exchange also, when we operate this, the companies that we work with, the constituents, the corporates, business owner, we start to look at their time to market, their risk profile, and how long do they, what are their needs in terms of their fundraising. But what we want to do now is, from a Bursa standpoint, two lands. Number one is really working with like-minded organizations such as SC Bank Negara, be part of JC Trade. I personally sit on the subcommittee 5 in terms of data needs, and also looking at how do we understand from the bank what are the data needs they have, so that we have a comprehensive data catalog that's published globally. Secondly, also is to make sure that our ESG climate reporting expertise are being shared and being worked together with the issuers, not only from a corporate standpoint, but also from their supplier standpoint. So we have consistent, comparable data sets. So I think that's the first role that the exchange seek to play in some of the activities that we deploy. The second thing we do is really looking at how do we be part of the ecosystem. So if we largely look at ESG, currently I think it is most people look at it from a compliance lens. So how do we facilitate an outcome that says your disclosure as well as your ESG practices reflected in your disclosure should create business value to you. So we view this as a 2 to 3 years journey, and we are starting to deploy projects and initiatives working with the rest of the stakeholders to facilitate that transition.
Thank you. So of course, Bursa, I think, launched FTSE for Good a full year before even the Paris Agreement, and they've been workshopping TCFD and adopted common reporting matters even well before IFRS S1 S2 was adopted here. So you're really trying very hard to be ahead of the curve, and I hope access to comparable data is going to prove to be useful for capital allocation decisions in the country. So one organization in Malaysia that has really invested a lot in looking into the space, not just helping to reduce the amount of emissions that are being financed, but monitoring, measuring, tracking their portfolios, is of course Maybank. Shahril, maybe you can share with us your thoughts on how we can make informed decisions about where capital goes.
Thank you. And thank you, Sisi. Yeah. Thank you to the Pradana Fellows Alumni Association for inviting us to be part of this. Very insightful points given by Puan Salmah and Sisi and Datin Seri Sunita. We've been going through this journey for a few years. It is not easy. There's a lot of conversations, and I do welcome these kind of conversations. But what I would like to say, and certainly from Maybank's perspective, we are the only bank present in all the 10 ASEAN countries, and we tend to take a very regional view. So there's a lot of learnings, but also at the same time, there's lots of opportunities that we see that we can go out and develop. But what I like to see that whilst Malaysia has done really well, I would say, in the region, yeah, and supported by the regulators, SC, Bank Negara, and Bursa, the regional view is not as inspiring. Yep. Well, ASEAN, we have close to 8% of the world's population, but today we contribute about 7% of the world's GHG emissions. And I think it will surpass the per capita number pretty soon, given the rate of development in the region. But at the same time, there are other challenges. For when we talk about transition, we will always go and look at coal-fired power plants, for example. There's about 400 coal-fired power plants in the region, and the lifespan of a normal coal-fired power plant is about 50 years. In ASEAN, the average age of the coal-fired power plant is about 13 years. So can you imagine the economic and the social costs of early retirement of such assets? And this is where the role of transition finance then needs to come in. And it is still a difficult conversation because it is still seen as complex. We still need to educate what's the difference between transition finance and sustainable finance and so on. In fact, there's no standard definition of sustainable finance and what more transition finance. So this is one of the things that we're trying to address through the Joint Committee on Climate Change, similar to CC, and of course driven by the SC, which co-chairs the JC3. Maybank is on the main committee of the Joint Committee on Climate Change. I, myself, Deputy Chair, Subcommittee 4, which is on capacity building. And very interesting development today. Maybank launched Malaysia's first transition finance framework at COP28 in Dubai. We are working closely under JC3 to develop decarbonization and transition finance guidance document today. What is important is to first understand what it involves. It's not just about browning, greening the brown and so on. There are a lot more things behind that, and we need to look at what it should involve. So for us, in making informed decisions, going back to your earlier question, it starts with a materiality assessment internally. So and as part of the materiality assessment, we need to understand the differences, what is actually physical risk and what is actually transition risk. And often there's that confusion there. There are the liability risks, that's important as well, but we look at that from a governance perspective. So, and once we understand that, and we work with stakeholders, we do a top-down and a bottom-up approach, and then we look at the high-risk sectors, or what we call the material sectors for ESG, and then that work gets interesting, because then we look how we need to review our industry positions, we need to review the risk acceptance criteria, we need to see how we integrate ESG considerations into credit. I'll stop there, but that's the starting point of making any informed decision, basically.
Great. I think it's so interesting that you referred to ASEAN. Of course, Malaysia will be chair by the time of COP29 in Baku. And I think Maybank is very active in the region as well, helping not only in the taxonomies, but also brainstorming how can we help our clients transition. And as a small open trading economy, we're particularly vulnerable to the sustainability ambitions of our trading partners. The European Union, of course, is the flag bearer in this respect, aside from being a sponsor of this event. And of course, coal plants, as you mentioned, in the region are particularly young. But a question that I've always asked myself is, do we need to compensate for foregone cash flows? Do we actually need to consider that? I wonder, because this is a classic market failure, where the polluter is profiteering, and this is information that was known well before the 15 years of the lifetime of the coal plant, and yet all of society is bearing the cost of inaction, and there's no compensation, etc. for this. So that's just a thought. If you want,
that is debatable. I'm sorry, Datin Seri Sunita, we go back. No, that is debatable. I mean, in your opening comments, you actually said that we are addicted to fossil fuels. Rather, we have not been given a choice. Nikola Tesla gave that option more than a century ago, but the powers that be decided, let's not go down that road. So we were not given that choice. And what we are today, the development of Malaysia as a nation, the development of ASEAN as a region, has been very much powered by fossil fuels, and we can't be what we are today without that. So I don't think it's fair to blame the asset owners for that, because number one, we were not given much option. Number two, we need to develop our country to the extent that we can, and that is when we start to talk about the principle of climate justice, about just transition and so on. I think now what it should be is about how do we manage just transition, how do we actually operationalize climate justice to the ability that we can for the interest of our people more than anything else.
Absolutely. We should all be working together for a smooth and just transition. But remember, Agenda 2030 in June 2015, and of course the Paris Accord in December 2015, virtually all countries in the world agreed to work on tirelessly to resolve this issue. So the next question I wanted to ask each of you was, so we've covered the question of how we're making informed decisions, but personally or from your organization's perspective, what are the interventions that you would consider would have outsized impacts for our national transition, bearing in mind that we want this to be smooth and just? And how can policymakers or regulators assist in or augment the impacts of this transition? Salmah.
I don't want to be the only sober and boring voice on the panel. I mean, I like the fact that Cik Shahril's gotten his head into the I suppose raising issues of equitable transition. But I think I go back to the fact that I think we're all seeing the same numbers. I think, which is why I always feel that you need to move away from diagnosing and look at solutioning already. And for the SC as early as 2015, and I do want to bring up the past only because I think we saw that this was coming. There's going to be a need for the huge demand for funding, and the conversation is always how do you unlock capital into this space. And we have, as structured as it sounds, we clearly set out in our plans 5 key strategies in 2019. We talked about how do you widen. And this, I mean, we call it 5 Eyes as part of this strategy to excite people. But essentially, it's just how do you bring funding into the real economic sector. We talked about we need to widen the SRI instruments available. One of the examples shown was SRI Sukuk. Cik Shahril raised about transitioning. The other instrument that we've put in place is SRI linked Sukuk. And under SRI Sukuk, we've had quite good take-up. So the solar plants in the country, a couple of the key ones have been funded through the SRI framework. And again, as I mentioned, the SRI linked Sukuk is for financing transition. We are having conversations with industry about how do you measure your effectiveness? How do you measure that you are having an impact? So that's one key area, having funding come in. And we are told that there is sufficient funding in the country and in the world. It just needs to be matched. It needs to be addressing the key issues that Cik Shahril talked about. You know, where is your risk management? Where do you ensure that the business of business is to make money and that it can still be maintained while ensuring that we're transitioning? The other area that we look at is how do you expand investor base? How do we bring in more people into the conversation through different product variation? I mentioned the SRI linked and SRI Sukuk, but I think retail investors want to get involved, and how they can get involved is through the creation of exchange traded funds. So those are the kinds of things that we're doing under the investor base. We're also looking at how do we instill a better governance culture, and that comes through with data availability. And that's supported by the information architecture that we want to see in place. So those are the kind of building blocks that we have put in place. And what is important right now is to mobilize funding to get that out, to get the structures out, to get investors involved, to get more information out there so that better questions are asked, not just by the fund managers, but by the institutional investors like the GLICs we have. We're very, very fortunate. The other big thing that's happened in the country is that the GLICs have also stepped out and made huge commitments to convert. I mean, you know, now that they've put it out there, they are putting their house in order to ensure that they are able to meet their own transition.
Thank you so much. I think that was a really good overview. I think it's particularly challenging because the context is changing so rapidly as well. So at one stage, for example, if you wanted to convert kilojoules to kilowatts, you'd be looking at energy-dense sources of fuel, and that's where coal, oil and gas rose to the top. And then when you look at the entire value chain and the emissions footprint, then renewable energies would float to the top. And now we're looking at how we're planning to finance all of this as well. What are the structures that would make it work, as it were? So from the stock exchange point of view, what do you think are the low-hanging fruit, the targeted or the muscular industrial policies that we could be looking at?
Yeah, so from a stock exchange standpoint, pardon the interruption, I think one of the things that we've been a big proponent of is really we think that carbon should be priced in. Case in point, if you look at the petrol subsidies, and once the structure is set in, it takes generations for you to either unwind a decision or continue to support that decision with the development in the market, in the industry, locally as well as internationally. So we think that's one of the things that we look forward to see, and we urge to work with the government to how to make that happen, because it speaks directly to the competitiveness of how Malaysia start to shape this industry at the nascent stage. Secondly, then if you look at what the building block of this transition from our angle, there are really 3 or 4 things that we look at. Number one is solving the reporting and data, which I spoke about at the opening. The second piece then is the how do we then connect not only the corporates but their supply chain to the financing ecosystem, and that's where our work with Central Bank, Bank Negara, SC, and Maybank is. We are looking at asset classes and instruments that will provide incentive for suppliers to incentivize their disclosure and to support their decarbonization journey, particularly the large SMEs that aims to or are exporting to customers nowadays. So that's the second piece. The third piece that we are looking at, really we operate the carbon exchange for Malaysia. We have a couple of options, but what we aim to really evolve this as the next phase really is the emissions trading scheme. And that has a bit of work that we need to do to make that to fruition. So really 3 or 4 building blocks, and hopefully through the actions that we put in place, that provides consistency, clarity, transparency in terms of how Bursa facilitating the rest of the ecosystem to look at how to allocate capital as well as to finance the just transition.
I think that's such an interesting angle. Pricing the negative externality, and of course will require dismantling of subsidies while minimizing leakage and runaway inflation. But it's interesting also that Bursa has decided to go down the voluntary market route while Article 6.2 is still not established yet, rather than mandatory trading schemes. For example, in EU and UK, we're seeing carbon prices of almost $100 per ton 2 years ago. And there's not very many businesses that will be able to pivot away from that. But that sends a very clear signal about the direction of travel that the government would like to see.
Yeah, so maybe as probably a soft answer to that, if you will, is that we believe that ESG pose the opportunity for Malaysia as a nation to regain international leadership. Now, if you think about, let's say, the ASEAN 5 in 1980s, the Korea, the Taiwan, and so on, we hope through ESG it gives us a lens of which we can participate and come to the table again. And as part of that is whether it's the right decision or the wrong decision, progress over perfection. Let's start to get, pick a side like FTSE for Good. We started, like you say, a year before, right? A bit before. And from this year, we are giving every single listed issuers in the main market, and next year for secondary or the ACE market, everyone a ESG, FTSE for Good ESG rating. And what that means to serve is to really give them a means to, number one, well, basically it's the carrot and the stick. And FTSE for Good is a very disclosure-centric rating methodology, so that for companies that start to look at what FTSE for Good wants them to do, or how they rate, how they are being scored, it will very naturally give them looking at the right places and focusing on the right things to do.
Yeah, I like that. So not just ESG, but also nature as well. Because while we might have contributed 0.4% of cumulative emissions historically, but we are one of only 17 countries of mega biodiversity. So, Shahril, to take your point on ASEAN, so ASEAN's going to be the 4th largest economy by 2040. What are the policies that you think where the policymakers, regulators should look more closely into to have outsized, to generate outsized impacts? What do you think?
Yeah, there are 2 things that need to be done, basically, besides the policy. Yeah, 2 things. Number 1 is still create better awareness and build up capacity. And number 2, align the ecosystem and the policies. I'll just quickly brief on number 1 because it's still very relevant today. Maybank is on the 40-member steering group of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And because of that, we are very active in G-Funds, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So recently, we conducted a survey through JC3, reaching out to all banks or financial institutions, insurance and so on, a survey on climate finance and transition. The response was quite surprising. 88 responses is that they lack capacity and they lack knowledge. Which 64% of these institutions said they don't have the knowledge about this. They don't have the human resource for this. So that's something that still needs to be built up. So whilst we talk about all this, I think that internal capacity needs to be built up. So number two, what needs to be done, and not just at ASEAN level, but especially at within the country level, is to create a better alignment within the ecosystem, right? Right now, there are many ministries who are doing a lot of things related to this, as we know, but there's still confusion among them as well. I think we have an opportunity to come together and create that better alignment, and with that better alignment, to really come down to, for example, we can connect from each financial institution's commitment, how that flows up to the NDCs. Right now, that's missing. We do not have a dashboard, but certainly we do not have a mechanism to see how collectively organizations, private companies, banks coming up together and contributing to the NDC. We do not have that view. There might be, but I don't know. But we don't have to do. So certainly that is something that we can do better. Number two, and this may be something to be thought about and may not be that popular, but we may need to be looking at some kind of carbon pricing mechanism. Today in ASEAN, there's only two countries. We have Singapore, we have carbon tax. We have Indonesia, which has some kind of mechanism, not European carbon tax. I think that will be a great incentive, to go forward in this transition journey.
It would absolutely help to align attention, align interest, focus, ambition, compensation as well, if we were to put a value to it. And it might not even need to be a tax, it could be shadow pricing, just to start to socialize this idea. And at some stage, of course, ecosystem services, right, is the reason why we're attracting so many data centers here, because our land is cheap, our electricity is subsidized, and our water is not fully priced with 40% NRW. So I think these are, once we can start to quantify this, even on a shadow pricing basis, I think that would help us much more in making informed decisions. But you touched on something very interesting about institutional capacity and interaction, the coordination between institutions. And I wanted to ask Salmah as well, going back to my opening remarks where I was asking, are institutions fit for purpose as well? Can you expand on, from a regulator's perspective, are we getting enough support for the transition from key institutions?
Again, I mean, I would pivot to what I had said earlier. I think the approach that we are taking, I mean, I guess in a way answering your question more widely, we've looked at the policy lever the government has put in place. The regulators then came in to say what's the funding mechanism that's needed to unlock. As we did that journey, we started speaking to and understanding where the institutions were heading towards. And again, they've put out the journey that they will undertake. What's required, and I think the main policy lever that I spoke of, the government has also put incentives in place. And I mean, I know a lot of people will say that incentives and grants shouldn't be the approach, because it's a heavy burden on public finances. But I think it is an important de-risking mechanism, and that's encouraging people to look at structures that work. What we are looking to do is, again, as I mentioned, policy levers, the funding framework, and the disclosure framework to ensure comparability. One of the tools in the disclosure framework is the taxonomy, and we are seeing issuers, people who are getting into the solar manufacturing space, looking at how do I access funding, how do I bring in investors, especially key investors. So I think my response would be yes, we are getting the kind of support. Is it being scaled up as quickly as required? Again, that's where the ecosystem has to come together. importantly, incentives and grants, and the keynote spoke about Gita and Gite at the national level. At the capital market level, we also have the bond and sukuk grant scheme. Now, one other area that I think the panel members have also spoken about is bringing everyone along in the journey. And from an ASEAN point of view, the importance of the SME segment cannot be underestimated. And that's where I think the SC directly and through our affiliate, the Capital Market Malaysia, has really pushed bringing the SMEs along that journey. I mean, again, because of what's happening in EU, again, because they're part of the supply chain. I mean, that's a category that cannot be underestimated, the impact to GDP, employment, people's lives. I mean, if we're talking about just transition. So the work that Capital Market Malaysia has done is to publish a couple of standards. I think I would encourage that to be more commonly used. And I think more importantly is the support that's been given to understand documents that are sent out. I think CMM has a program called Elevate, which then brings these companies along on where do they need to be, because it can be confusing for people who I mean, we're talking about NTCs. I think the number that KRI had shared was 14,000 companies. I would hesitate in putting the impact to GDP, but I think under that the bulk of the SMEs that need to be along the journey. I think from an ASEAN point of view, that's an important segment. And then I think from a regulator, policymaker point of view, it is also again another important segment.
Thank you so much, Pan Salmah. Of course, we want sufficient capacity in the capital markets so that institutions are able to operate off a principles-based taxonomy. But the flip side is that it reduces comparability, doesn't it? And for ASEAN, I think the importance for us also is indirect physical risks that we might be exposed to. So when we're concentrating on the lowest unit, business level, enterprise level, or even industries, we might be missing out on indirect physical risks. For example, the roads are impassable, we are a country with no food security, we're going to have supply chain interruptions, we're seeing hyperinflation for medical equipment, etc. So this makes it even more essential that the institutions are helping us navigate this, isn't it? So for the two gentlemen, and after these last two questions, we're going to be taking questions from the floor at the microphones that are on the stairs. So how much of the transition from the stock exchange and from the banking point of view, how much of the transition can we finance without external support? How much can we do domestically, and how much do we need from foreign agencies or countries? How much support do we need?
So thanks, Datin Sunita. Datin Seri Sunita. So as part of preparing for this, I try to look out for how much is needed to finance global transition. One of the figure that comes in is globally global investment into technology for this purpose is 1.3 trillion for 2022, and subsidies actually is twice that. So that's kind of starting. But looking at the scale, at the size of this, I think it needs both a domestic as well as foreign. Now it goes back into, and it's related to the earlier question about how to accelerate and how to deploy capital in a more informed basis. So what we think is that it goes back to the pension funds, for example, institutional investor, what their investment mandates are. Their primary role is create ROI for contributors, and that's how compensation drives behavior. And we work very hard to look at the different parts of the ecosystem, and three of them are pretty close to our heart. The first one is the investors that allocates money, so basically the investing community. The second part are the financial institution, and that is predicated upon the need to create financing incentive for SMEs and bring them along the journey. And the third piece really is to look at international ecosystem. So what we want to do from an international ecosystem really is to, so we have signed the MOU and form a 4-year collaboration with ASEAN exchanges. So the Indonesia Stock Exchange, Thailand Stock Exchange, Singapore Stock Exchange, Philippines Stock Exchange. and Bursa Malaysia, we have an MOU. In the past 1 year, we have worked tirelessly to discuss with them and urge them to join the journey together as we build this very nascent ecosystem. Let's make sure that we are working on let's make sure that when we order the dishes, we look at the same menu and make sure that the data, for example, can be interoperable. The ecosystem speaks to each other and augment ASEAN as a unified market. And how do we bring ASEAN not only connected within the region itself, but also work with fellow exchanges around the world to say, okay, how do we, if SMEs, if a supplier to a listed company here demonstrate the right behavior, how do we incentivize them by giving them better opportunities globally? As well as from an investment standpoint, if companies here have demonstrated good behavior, how do we bring them, connected them to the Invest Malaysia event, for example, that's profiled the international investor globally.
Thank you, Cici. Shahril, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about this, how to tap the foreign markets, how to support the transition domestically. What are your thoughts on how much we can do internally with domestic access to funds, and how much do we need to tap from a foreign pool of funds?
I think the first question to ponder upon is that is liquidity an issue? Because I take great pains to explain what banks, not just Maybank, what banks overall do, and given the fact that most banks in Malaysia have got sustainability targets, and most have been exceeding their target. So, for example, Maybank, we made a sustainable finance commitment in 2021 to mobilize 50 billion ringgit in sustainable financing by 2025. We revised that target to 80 billion because we were doing well, right? And so our 80 billion target in sustainable financing by 2025, we are going to meet this year, more than a year ahead of target. And which means, there is that funding, but not just from Maybank, for all Malaysian banks as well. And from a regional perspective, see how big this pool is. Yeah, from a regional perspective, if I were to look at DBS over a 3-year horizon, DBS has mobilized 70 billion Singapore dollars in sustainable financing. UOB has mobilized 45 billion Sing dollars. HSBC has mobilized 294 billion US dollars in financing. So there is that financing, but oftentimes that education that is required. So what we do, we have a sustainable product framework that provides eligibilities and what can qualify sustainable finance and what documentations are required and how they can be developed into sustainable performance targets and KPIs. That's when the discussion tends to get a bit because then that's when, but we take that in our stride, because that's when the educating part comes in. And I think that's important because going down that road, it is necessary for us to go into the education. But in terms of whether that's enough or not, then we go to the next level of financing in terms of some of those where it still poses a greater risk from a credit perspective for banks and from private investors. So then we talk about blended finance, and this is where there's been a lot of conversations about blended finance. Not too much happening in Malaysia though, because as I said, liquidity is not an issue, but there will be conversations that when the project may not be traditionally commercially viable, so it needs to go down that road. Now, Indonesia in the region is the most active blended finance market in ASEAN. Yeah, we saw over 12 billion US dollars or more than 40 deals transacted by the end of 2022. Yeah, so that's big there. But for Malaysia, there's still that kind of funding. So, for example, Malaysia government has announced 2 billion ringgit in seed funding under the NETR to enable catalytic blended finance for energy transition projects. So it is there. So the short answer to your question, yes, we can welcome foreign funding. We should be looking at ways how we can incentivize private organizations to invest more at a lower risk through mechanisms such as blended finance. But at the end of the day, liquidity is still there.
Thank you so much. We have such a great panel here. We're hearing from the capital markets regulator, the stock exchange, the largest financial services group in the country. Do any of you have any questions for them? You need to go up to the mic.
Good morning, just checking. Audible? Good morning, distinguished speakers. Good morning, moderator. I have a slightly more abstract and philosophical question. When I think about the capital markets themselves, it seems like they're morally neutral structures, right? They exist solely to facilitate the trading relationship. They don't assign value judgments or moral judgments or moral qualities to the goods that are traded on the capital markets. If that is in fact the case, then it seems like markets only incentivize what is expedient and not that which is morally superior. Now, if you buy that premise, it seems like the foundational reason why there's stagnation in the generation of interest in green technology is because of the market itself. I'm wondering if you sort of agree to that philosophical premise or you disagree with that. Yeah, thank you.
Expedient or morally superior?
Okay,
What is
I'm
the
not
role
gonna-
of the market?
as regulators often do, we don't answer the questions directly. So I'll pivot away to but in all seriousness, it's not something that we don't think about, and I think maybe it's being Asian and our value system and ensuring the fact that we want to make sure that it's an inclusive society. And I'll just maybe take one step back and say that at the ST sometimes what we do think about is how we are pulled all over the place, in very many different directions. I'm sorry that maybe it's not even about climate finance or even transition, but just generally what is the regulatory philosophy for a capital market regulator. We did put out a document a couple of years ago. I mean, I'm mentally reminding myself that we probably have to update that, the regulatory philosophy. And we did very clearly say a few years ago in a policy document that we put out that we want a stakeholder economy. I know it sounds ambitious, nebulous. I mean, what is it that you're trying to achieve? How we translate that is ensure that standards are practiced, high standards are practiced, good corporate governance culture is instilled, enough disclosure is put in place, engagements happen, people understand what they need to put up. I mean, and the next level would be like, we put up codes of conduct. I mean, we have sales practices, know your client. So if you look at the alignment, of course, the capital market exists to fund the real economy. There is risk sharing. There needs to be enough education to bring everyone along. The objective is still an inclusive society. And the point I wanted to make about being pulled all over the place is when we look at the industrial market master plan, and we look at NETA, and then one could say that, as you mentioned earlier, we are pulling in all the data centers. Is it a strain on our resources? But of course, we do note that the data centers that are coming in, they have their own green ambition. So they do also want green energy. So is that going to be the catalyst that's going to require us to scale up? So I think we know that we are serving a wide range of investors, people who still need financial literacy, but we still are also on the other extreme, looking at people who want very risky products. So I think, I mean, it's not that we're not aware and we're addressing it in different ways.
So thanks, Salma. I think as Bursa, I'm obligated to support you. But at the same time, I think you have given me some time to think, so I'll try to answer from my point of view as well. So I think the gentleman over there, it's a matter of balance, right? So I think there's this long-term view, and in essence, it's about governance, it's about structure, it's about good practices. But at the same time, we are also part of the essential part of the ecosystem, global ecosystem. So what we do, what happens outside as the externalities will impact us. So how do we, take broad strides? At the same time, from a short-termism standpoint, I think as Asian country community, and this is a view that I heard a couple of times from different foreign visitors, is that we are we very easily fall into the trap of groupthink. And as Malaysia, sometimes it gets into the echo chamber of, repeating what the global north is talking about, or even among ourselves. So the approach we try to take from a Bursa standpoint is that if there is a long-term collective decision to get somewhere, how do we facilitate that process? So just take the green transition, for example. If you think about, let's say, the philosophy about carbon, how do we use that to send pricing signals to price into the market strategically? Or if you look at the transition itself, the conversation we have with different constituents and stakeholders, how do we understand each other's interests, create steps whereby we can address and make sure that there's win-win outcome for everybody, and lastly, put actions together. Now, we can't do it together. We'll have to do it, as a group.
Datin Seri Sunita looking at me as a industry player. I'm obliged to say that both my regulators are correct and doing the great things. I'll just go back to what CC said. When Salmah and I we went to school together, I never debated with her then as a fellow student. I'll never debate with her now as a regulator lah. But CC mentioned about getting things in alignment. I'll go back to what I said earlier in the first place. The philosophical debates about how we should go about. I think we come together better first. Get the alignment together better. Then they have visibility. I mean, for platforms like this are really great to do that. But I wish the infrastructure can be better in terms of coming together, so we know what will be outcomes of doing this to others, so that we know the knock-on effects and so on. Particularly because as the science is still evolving, we talk about climate finance, and we need to know what kind of level of support there will be. There's so many frameworks. I like to say that there's so many frameworks out there. And there's so many roadmaps. We really need the roads now more than anything else. Time is running short, but yes, that better alignment will help addressing questions like that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. Half a century ago, you could win a Nobel Prize for saying that the only responsibility of the business is to account to its shareholders. And at that point, social license to operate referred to businesses, for example, in hazardous ways, something where it's very clear that there's going to be societal impacts. But now, almost every business is asked to account for their social license to operate. And the threat on the other side of this sharpened accountability is that it'll be difficult for bankers to lend you money, investors to invest in you, consumers won't want to buy your products, and people won't want to work for you if you're not aligned with this common good that all of society recognizes, isn't it?
I just want to jump in there because I think I recall a conversation we were having this week, just to what you're saying. Imagine overlaying that with the digital revolution, where the machine tells you, what the answer is. And one of the things, we had a very good discussion this week about that. And again, as I said at that session, it really feels consequential. We have the digital revolution happening, and we have to address climate change. So we have to keep asking ourselves, where's our moral compass?
Absolutely. And in facing these macro poly crises, how are we going to navigate, harmonize rather than prioritize, right? How are we going to do this? And my last question to all of you would be institutions fit for purpose, which is becoming like a pet topic of mine this year. Nationally, how are institutions fit for purpose, and what would we like to see them doing on a national level? But there is a question?
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
All right. Sorry.
All right. Thank you very much for the wonderful conversation. I would want to a bit shift the conversation from the top and trying to bring it down a bit. Why am I doing so is the realization of the fact that we have more than 80% of young youth seated in this gathering, and the conversation is largely around the top, speaking about governmental intervention and programs, and also looking at how the private sector are trying to come in to play their role. I want to bring it down to the youth. So how do we, as the regulator, the financier, how do we come about a mechanism to bring about product and a sort of programs that aligns the aspiration of the youth in terms of their entrepreneurship, in trying to leverage, even trying to play their part in this goal of climate sustainability. So the aspiration of the youth, trying to get financing for their projects in order to play at the bottom of the pyramid. How do we come about programs and structures to democratize that? So my question is largely facing the Maybank and also, I think, the regulator. Thank you very much.
Let's take all the questions first. There's another question. She sat down. Over here, sorry.
Yeah, hi. So I think just reflecting on the conversation globally and within the region as well, there's been a lot of focus on an infrastructure-centric energy transition. I was wondering, from a regulatory standpoint or even from a financing standpoint, how can we embed more people-centric dimensions into either eligibility criteria or even sort of graduation of SMEs into some sort of listing to drive that conversation to focus more on the people-centric agenda of things? Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Maizatun. I'm the coordinator for Climate Change Policy and Law Center, International Islamic University. So I'm from the legal background here. From the discussion just now, we see a lot of development in our financial landscape. We see a lot of soft law being introduced by Securities Commissions, Bank Negara, and so on. But my concern is that we do not have a robust, effective legal framework on climate change. Until now, we do not have a climate change law yet. We do have a climate change law at the state level. State of Sarawak already have, but it is insufficient. My concern is that because we're talking about regulation, we're talking about enforcement, we're talking about, getting investors to come in, we're talking about what else? Transparency and accountability. So I believe that, having a effective legal system is very important, because what we have right now is only a soft law, and then they are not, we're talking about data, we're talking about the continuity, sustainability, and at the end of the day, we want to make sure that climate change is not looking at just as a commodity, but something that needs to be looked at from the environmental perspective as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry. Also from a legal perspective, I'm a practicing lawyer in ESG, and I have similar questions to what the doctor mentioned. In terms of SE and Bursa, I've talked extensively of the regulatory reporting requirements that they may have. But my question really is, how much, beyond the scope of just reporting, how much due diligence is actually being done to check these reports to make sure that greenwashing is not occurring, and actual enforcement action? Because I've not actually heard of any enforcement action being taken against companies beyond just whether they need to report. Someone can report, but what they're saying actually has no overall beneficial effect to the environment or to their company. So the first question relates to what is SE and Bursa actually doing to monitor these companies and what they're reporting. Secondly, I have a specific question for the learned gentleman from Bursa, and it relates to the carbon exchange which you mentioned. Obviously, it has been highly publicized in the news, but one of the things that has recently come up is that one of the main items that was traded in the last carbon exchange relating to the Sri Lankan cardamom project is now defunct, but Bursa was selling those credits. So how is that being consolidated with what businesses are buying, and how you yourself are actually doing your due diligence within your organization?
Right. Hi, my name is Hasmizal. I'm actually from an education institutions, right? So I have the background from financial reporting and auditing. Right. My question is that the sustainability reporting, ESG reporting, is going to be made mandatory perhaps in the future. Right now it's only voluntary, and there is a lot of framework is being developed just to make sure that every single entities in Malaysia is doing so. Right. My question is that would you actually consider on the assurance part, for example, are you going to enhance the assurance standard on how to actually re-audit the sustainability informations before it being produced to the users? Because users are depending on this information to make decision making, which is crucial for them. So that would be my question. Thank you.
Hello, Madini here from Climate Action Malaysia. So my question is probably a continuation of the gentleman over there who asked about the youth involvement. So what are the efforts currently being undertaken in developing the framework related to just transition to include voices from the grassroots to safeguard the interests of vulnerable communities, including indigenous communities, women, and the young people? Thank you.
Thanks so much. So, I think generally, youth involvement, whether climate or marginalized communities, people-centric decision making, and we're all familiar with tragedy of commons, tragedy of horizons, not just a commodity type approach, but also ecosystem assurance. We've mandated sustainability reporting at the regulated licensed entities as well as the listed companies. What about assurance for the next stage? So any of these questions, I think we've run out of time, but I'm just not getting the signal from anyone, so maybe they're allowing us to overrun. I didn't see you. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Okay, thank you.
Maybe a very quick one, because I think the first and the last question I think is interrelated, and I would encourage looking at what the government is also doing. Again, methodology is going to be the same. If you're expecting me to give a different answer, then it's not. I think we look at where the policy drivers are, policy levers are. How can that be supported through the funding? So the government has put out quite aggressive I guess, I don't want to use the word roadmap, but aggressive plans to increase or elevate the Malaysia as a high economy country. So I think KL20 is one of those aspirations, and funding is available for young people to participate in programs run by Cradle, MDAC. There's incubators, accelerators, programs in place for clean energy technology. Very quickly on that. And then on assurance, it's something that we're studying. Same with the question on, things are put out. Are we looking at the possibility of greenwashing? Both greenwashing regulations are considered, and the need to have assurance is also being studied very closely.
So I think maybe trying to get bits and parcel of the questions here, and if I don't touch on your question, feel free to engage with us for the rest of the day. I think if we kind of look at the ecosystem, we have a lot of events such as Climate Finance Summit and so on that rightfully should be put in place to drive awareness, understanding, get buy-in. But at the end of the day, from our involvement and our observation, it is still quite new in the industry. A lot of the things that you talk about, be it the legal framework and maybe from a people-centric approach, is possibly the stage of where we are in the industry, whereby right now, even if you want to make policy, for example, do you have a bird eye view of all the data? Do you have complete data sets to make informed decision? I think the colleagues on my right probably agree with me as well. So the question that we kept asking ourselves is that how do we operate when we do not have complete information? So then we start to think about, if we kind of line the ducks up, the first one really is that awareness building, buy-in, getting different people's opinions, testing, and then we start to set rough framework, policies and standards. Then once these are being put in place, then you have the infrastructure coming in, and based off the infrastructure, you adjust and you pivot. Now, from a people standpoint, then people have a free will to choose what they want. Now, of course, we are within the Malaysia environment, we are within the ASEAN environment. We are largely influenced. From a youth standpoint, a lot of our understanding, a lot of our observation is that the youth have their own principle. They come to us and they, in many cases, contribute not from a very traditional joining a company or taking a role, but really coming and say, this is where we are, this is where my heart is, and how do I contribute? and we find ways to work with them to contribute. So the people largely will start to form different opinions and different ideologies, and I think currently now they are is a bit more polarized than before. But from a legal framework then standpoint is how do we provide the legal framework to support the policy, and subsequently how do we provide assurance. Now, from a more hard angle, the mandatory reporting regime was put in place for listed issuers starting end of last year. So only by this year in Malaysia, these data sets starts falling. It is largely in line globally. For example, in Australia, climate reporting start to fall in place, I think, next year, 2025. And on top of asking for climate reporting, they are also asking for, I think, assurance as well. I don't know whether it's limited or reasonable, but there's assurance as well. And I think in Singapore, for example, it's still a voluntary basis. And Indonesia and Thailand have also put some of these in place. So I think it goes in phases. So I'll probably not drag on and I'll probably just pause here.
Yeah, I'll just allude to because both Salmah and CC have spoken about from the regulatory perspective, from the youth perspective. Yeah, right now there is no dedicated solution for youth in terms of climate financing. Yeah? But it will still go down to the use of proceeds, whatever it is. However, for some reference, the Commonwealth Secretariat out of London actually came up with a report called Climate Finance for Youth. Yeah, and that was just in 2022, not too long ago. So you can access that report out of the Commonwealth Secretariat. But one of the main recommendations made in that report is that there needs to be more localized community-led funding for youth for that support. However, they do have visibility of that through this Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. So if you can just take a look at that, then you may have that access for whatever project you're thinking about.
Thank you so much. I think this has been a great discussion. You've been a great panel. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights.